Today is October 28th, 2022. I am Jennifer Andrulli, and I am here with Meda DeWitt. We are on Zoom. Meda is in Anchorage, Alaska, and I am in Soldotna, Alaska. Thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed today. As you know, we will be talking about the various uses of plants. This and other recordings regarding ethnobotany, ethnomedicine, ethnoherbalism, and traditional healing will become part of the oral history collection at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and will be placed online in an ethnobotany project jukebox hosted by the university. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. Let's start with traditional introductions.
Ganesh Chish, Dleka Kleinach, Meda DeWitt, Yuchat Duasak, Shinget Kleinach, Zetinak Yuchat Duasak, Anyaina Chatsiti, Kachari Yari Chatsiti, Shtakin Kwan Ayachet. My English name is Meda DeWitt. My Tlingit names are Tsetzinak and Kat Duklaat. My adopted Inupiaq name is Tigiguluk, and my adopted Northern Cree name from Harry Watchmaker is Boss Eagle Spirit Woman. And I am calling in from Dena'ina, Atlanta. My family comes from Wrangell, Alaska, which was Shtakin Kwan, as well as Yakutat, Alaska. And I was born on Prince of Wales Island in Klawock in Alicia Roberts' house. I am Tlingit. I'm also Haida and some Tahltan and a lot of Scottish as well, and Irish and Norwegian Viking and Austrian and some French. I have, my fiance is James Christopher Paley, and we have 8 children total, 4 mine and 4 his. And you may pick up some laughing in the background on the recording today, but that's just part of life, and also Native households is generally having kids and lots of kids around.
Thank you again for sharing your wisdom around plant medicine, ethnoherbalism, traditional healing. Where would you like to start today?
Well, there's a lot to talk about. The process of Indigenous medicine is not linear and cookie cutter. It is individualistic to the community, to the tribes, and to the people who are practicing it. And so maybe starting with some of those concepts is really important. So in Alaska, we have 6 major ecoregions. Our state is quite large. It's 20% of the United States land mass. And we have over 11 different languages and 22 different dialectical variants. And each one of those groups within them has family and clan groups. Now, we can say ubiquitously, we all use plants as food and medicine, and there's very similar uses throughout the entire state, and there's even some plants that live throughout the entire state. However, the relationship between a family or a clan or an individual and how they utilize their recipes, the stories, the songs, the prayers, the protocols, they may be different from group to group. And so it's really important that we recognize this independence or autonomy. It's not just for the whole group. In government to government relationships, sovereignty is also practiced throughout our strata of society, pre-contact. So in the context that I speak from is very pan-Alaskan, and that's because I've had a lot of teachers. I even have education in plant medicine down in the Oregon and Washington area, starting in my childhood from my grandfather. So I have taught in every ecoregion in the state, not every community, because that's a lot. That's like 229 communities. But I have taught in every ecoregion and cultural group in the state, as well as in Yukon Territories, Canada. And like I said, in Oregon and Washington and Montana. So the journey of ethnoherbalism, which I have to say that term, ethnoherbalism, was coined by our illustrious Jennifer Andrulli, who is also a plant medicine person and a peer and a leader in our philosophy in traditional healing in the state. So I really love using that term because it focuses on the story part. Ethnobotany is more of a scientific or Western viewpoint of traditional medicine and traditional plant medicine. And, we have to reframe our locus of control. We have to reframe where we're speaking from and what perspective we're in. Because, for instance, when you say decolonization, the focus is still on the colonizer, right? So we call it, a better word is indigenization, right? Or there's other words that we can use that focus from our worldview and from our fixed point in the universe. And when we do this, it helps to, instead of fighting for the permission to be something, you're asserting that you are that thing and that already exists and that it is a fundamental truth that can't be removed. So in ethnoherbalism, it's speaking from story and relationship and relatives with the plants, animals, and nature. Dr. Oscar Quigley was an Yupik philosopher, and he wrote some really great papers. One of them really speaks to me, and I found out later that my auntie, Meda DeWitt, was actually married to Dr. Quigley during those years, and she did the typing and the editing and helped co-create his the content. It is his content. It is his intellectual property, but she was there to help dialogue with him and fill in gaps and be that sacred feminine to that sacred masculine. But in that patriarchal system, it was just safer for him to own all that content. So my cousin is Tamari Quigley. They had a child together. And so reading in his works, I can really identify with many pieces of it. And then later found out that's why, because my auntie, my family helped to inform that thinking in a real tangible way. So it works. And one of the things that he talks about is the role of a medicine person. And the role of a medicine person, and he uses the term shaman. Shaman is a Yakutian word from Yakuts in Russia, and it was adapted by anthropologists to describe all medicine people. In our state, shaman is used as a easy catchphrase, but it doesn't actually speak to the layers and the individuality of our groups and our medicine people and how they operate. It's like saying traditional healer. Traditional healer is analogous to saying like doctor, doctor of psychiatry or doctor of podiatry or doctor of veterinary medicine, right? We have lots of different doctor terms. And so we have to be really conscious when we're speaking to a group in not only understanding what we're saying, but maybe understanding what they're saying at the same time. So Dr. Oscar Quigley was talking about a medicine person or an anesthetist. Sorry. I don't know if you need me to start over and you edit it or just keep going.
Nope. There will be no editing.
Okay. Well, I have a really big family, so.
Okay. It's okay.
Yeah. So understanding where that framework is coming from. So Dr. Oscar Quigley was specifically speaking about medicine people and their role. And he was speaking about Echt and Slinget, which is our deep medicine people, right? The shamans. And their role is being the intermediary of the spiritual world, the natural world, and the human world. And that intermediary, their job is to understand where the imbalance is and what actions by which party are necessary to balance those situations to create harmony. And that harmony is the foundation of a thriving, healthy ecosystem and thriving, healthy human communities and healthy human spirits. And when we look at that as a profession, that's a very noble space to be in, but it's also very challenging to be in that space, to be in that liminal space between all three. And we have traditional protocols. There's reasons why those deeply spiritual and sensitive people were generally, stayed away from the community. They had a house or a camp that was not in the community proper. One, it reduces the noise. Two, it reduces maybe the social drama that somebody might be brought into. And it helps to be the intermediary because they're not then solely, just steeped in the human world. They're also in the natural world. So when we're looking at that, that's one layer, right? That deep, deep layer. But it's really hard to stay in that space. And so many of us may dip in and out of that space, but may not retain that kind of work. And so then as you look at traditional healers and their different gift sets, there's the plants as food and medicine, so ethnoherbalism. And, being the community herbalist, there were every single community, every single house, every single person had a foundational knowledge of the plants around them and how to use them as food and medicine. And so many times the work that we're doing now in this process of rematriation of our traditional culture and content, our knowledge base, when we're bringing that back, many of us are teaching just foundational use and knowledge that even our 5 and 6-year-olds might have known pre-contact. And then when you had specialty items that couldn't be handled in the home or couldn't be handled by normal application, then you would go to the next layer up, right? The community herbalist, or the community, body worker, or the community spiritual intermediary. And so you had specialists that focused in these different regions. And some of them may be the interface with the animals. Some of them may be the interface with the plants. Some of them may be the interface with, spirit. And so that was much easier to handle on a regular basis at that level of focus and operation. What happened during contact is multiple layers. We had at contact, the exposure to microbes that we had not been exposed to before. And there, most people know about the influenza and, smallpox. There's also venereal diseases, which isn't talked about very much. That's one of the challenges that we had, was this transition from a matrilineal society to a patriarchal society. And I don't say matriarchal because that's still a pyramidal process. And so it's matrilineal egalitarian is actually the structure that we had throughout the state. And there's different variations of social stratification and caste systems depending on what group you're in. Like up north, you have the whalers that are the leaders, the elder women who were the knowledge keepers and had the last say. And then you had the community that was very egalitarian. Whereas you get all the way down to southeast and you have, the lead man, and you have the elder women and elders who were there balanced and made sure that they were doing what they're supposed to do. And then you had noble commoners and laborers. But overall, we're matrilineal and mostly egalitarian. And at contact, we had a disruption in our communal systems. Some of our communities lost 90% of their people to smallpox and influenza. Some communities lost everybody. The whole town, passed away. Or we have stories of elders where it's more than once. There's a story of like a young boy or 2 young boys who ended up having to bury as many people as they could or set fire to their community and then walk away, or grandma's, little children having to walk away, and talking about how eventually they were found and taken to a local orphanage. And so our history is very complex because not every community had the same relationship with contact. In the Aleutian Islands, we had 1741, we had contact with Vitus Bering, and we had this onslaught of Russian traders who were basically just ravenously, murdering and pillaging and extracting just almost at a furious pace, a fervor that was so grotesque that when the Russian priests came over and saw it, they were ashamed of their people. And they asked for priests to come over from Russia, not to assimilate the Alaska Native people, but to put their own people in check, put the Russian traders in check, because it was so bad. We have stories of elders from like the Refuge Rock, where this, it came through the communities, what was happening from the Russians, and it was the raping and molestation and mutilation of women was so bad that an entire community's worth of women went up to Refuge Rock, the women and the daughters and the children, and they all jumped off the cliff so that they could have a clean, honorable death, and their children did not have to face that level of trauma. So those are realities that we face in the state. I think that the Aleutians probably had it the hardest. Not that anybody wins at the Trauma Olympics, but just acknowledging that that's a real experience, and they did have the hardest exposure out of the rest of the group. So that colonization, it was tempered by their own priests, but it still advanced over into Southeast Alaska. We had trades with the Russians within 100 years. And then throughout the state on the coasts, there's a lot of Russian influence and trade. And then when you go up further, up north with the Inupiaq people, theirs was much later. It wasn't until the late 1800s with the Boston whalers that the Boston whalers came up. And again, it's that biowarfare. They would take people in by gunpoint into homes with people who were infected with smallpox, and they would infect the whaling captain's house on purpose to basically take out their competition and break down the social structures. Because once you take out those key keystones or those important house posts of a community, then they're easier to control. Interior Alaska was more by the U.S. Army or the Hudson Bay Trading Company had that influence. In Southeast Alaska with the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian, because there's no actual invisible border, geopolitical border, there are people who live in the Yukon territories, and their exposure was much later than on the coast, and their exposure was from the Hudson Bay Trading Company. So we have all these different stories and relationships throughout the state. And the reason why this is important when we're talking about medicine is because our medicine was also affected at these same times. One of the cornerstones of a community was, and sometimes still is, the medicine person, whether they're the midwife, whether they're the icht, right? Whether they're the herbalist or the bone setter. They were wise people who were cornerstones of the community and helped to create that resilience within the community. So, for instance, we can look at our neighbors to the south, the Hopi. They didn't allow their children to go to boarding schools. The medicine men would not allow it. And they were more obedient to their medicine men than they were to the missionaries. So the military came in and they worked together, and they actually arrested the 19 medicine men from the Hopi tribes, and they put them on Alcatraz. And they were they were never brought back. So that model came up to Alaska. They already knew when they got here, and they being the United States military and other advancers of colonization, knew that you have to get rid of the medicine people to be able to effectively manipulate and control a population. And it was very synchronized in the way that they went about this process. They either took them out and murdered them and buried the body or disposed of it in some way, or they sent them to in penitentiaries or insane asylums. You know, Elder Bob Sam. He should have an honorary doctorate because of his work, but Elder Bob Sam talks about Morningside and how Morningside was a very specific place that people were sent to be disposed of, either forgotten of or tidily, put down. And so that repatriation of those bodies is so important because that's part of our story and people going missing. There was also the influence of the missionaries working in tandem with these biological effects of smallpox and the influenza that I keep referring to, because it's intertwined. It's a braided experience. They're not separate from each other. But in Chills and Fevers, it is a book, and it talks about how the missionaries withheld vaccines until medicine people converted to Christianity. And that was their logical argument that their God was more powerful than our belief system because their medicine was more powerful than the medicine person's medicine. Which it's challenging because if you think about the way that medicine was done, everything happened really quickly. You could have a community that was fine who didn't even have contact, but then had the contact to the virus through, vectors of different means that traveled faster than the missionaries or the military or the explorers or the traders. And so you could lose a whole community, 90% to a whole community, without them ever even actually having contact. So they were able to show that their medicine was more powerful. And then there was that option to change over or basically go missing. And so at that time, our medicine traditions, they were disrupted in their overt or public way. And because this is for our long-term knowledge base, what I want to say is one of the challenges that we're facing is that a term, we'll just say bad medicine, right? Dark medicine. And dark's not even the right term because traditionally nighttime or dark was not bad. So the concept of bad is associated with manipulation of people for gain, without empathy or just reason. And so bad medicine, since it was already underground, continued to exist underground in its full context, and then handed down, from apprentice to, or from, practitioner to apprentice. And so a lot of people associated our traditional medicine with the, bad medicine practices. And it was also said that our traditional medicine was evil by the missionaries, which then was this like perpetuating concept that fulfilled itself. And we have our people who are practitioners, good medicine or neutral medicine, and what they did was either they stopped all the way or they bifurcated their knowledge. They handed out packets of knowledge to different people in the family that was not whole. And it was very intentional. And I've heard about this as a strategy actually in multiple communities throughout the state, that knowledge was given segmented, because any one person having a full body of knowledge, it actually put them at risk, and they were afraid. And I dealt with this early on in my career when I started speaking and working as a traditional healer and using the title as a traditional healer. I actually got a lot of pushback from people in the community because they would say, you can't call yourself that. And if you call yourself that, then you're not really that. And there's a lot of mixing that happens. Like I said, you have to understand what frame of lexicon or terminology that people are working from. Because some people think that traditional healer means actual full-fledged medicine person icht, right? Not realizing that it's this kind of broad terminology like doctor. And that's one. And then the other part of it is, that traditionally you didn't have to say who you were, because if you were really the thing that you were, then the whole community would know anyways. You were the person that they would go see for, herbal work or body work or being the intermediary. Like, it was just your station that you didn't have to go and announce yourself as being that thing. And then the other dynamics that are in play is the concept of Christianity and humility, almost to the point of self-deprecation, right? So being austerely humble, as Jesus was. And if you look at Jesus through an Indigenous lens, he was a very powerful medicine person that did great works. And he didn't have to say who he was, because his work announced who he was, right? It was not challenged. And so that's okay in that concept. But it doesn't apply to people working under a traditional healer, right? The doctor title. And then another aspect was that what we were just speaking about in the concept before this is people being taken out and murdered. So there's that fear that if you stand up and identify yourself, that you will have a target on your back. And I literally had elders say, you will now have a target on your back. And I have elders who said that in snide ways. And I've had elders who said that but know what I'm doing. And so they pray for me, and they've prayed for me on a regular basis over the 10 years, 12. Well, actually it's been longer than that. What are we, 2022? I think it's about like 12 years, openly making that commitment to being a traditional healer. And they continually pray for me now to this day, so that I can continue my work in the community, because we don't operate off of an individual ego-based structure where you and you alone are strong enough to do all these things and you conquer everything. That's not a traditional concept. The traditional concept is that matrilineal egalitarian, where we support each other, and those networks, as we come together, it's like a raft or a system that helps to elevate each other as we move up, or it can bring us down as a group as well. So this rematriation of traditional healing has not been an easy one. And Jennifer and I are able to operate at the way that level we operate on because our elders held that space. Karen Brooks held that space as a traditional healer. Dr. Rita Blumenstein held that space as a traditional healer. Della Keats held that space as a traditional healer. Alicia Roberts was a known healer in the community. And others, many others who faced the criticism, sometimes ridicule, bullying, were ostracized, who were put down, through the process of colonization and lateral violence and shame. They were generally not well compensated many times and lived in a lot of poverty, and they had their own issues. We're all living in a colonized process and perspective. We do not have the fully formed communal structures that would have supported us. So there's all the dysfunctions that come along with that, but then still have to operate in this way of being. And they did that. And that is honorable and brave and heroic, really, to be able to stand out in that way. That allows us to more freely operate as traditional healers, even though there was that initial pushback, and then also, that continued lateral violence that occurs and unreasonable standards. I think that's part of the hardest one, is the expectation that you're perfect in a Christ-like manner, when many of us have been through the same thing as everybody else.